y'all. It's good to see you here tonight. If you're tired, just keep sitting down. But if you're not, stand up with us. Let's sing. Some of y'all look tired. That's okay. Nothing I could do or say could make your love for me change. There's no place I could run and hide that you won't be right by my side. 'Cause your love never fails. It's grace, grace, God's grace. It's grace that's greater than all our sin. Nothing I could do or say could make your love for me change. There's no place I could run and hide that you won't be right by my side. 'Cause your love never fails. It's grace, grace, God's grace. It's grace that's greater than all our sin. It's grace, grace, God's grace. It's grace that's greater than all our sin. There ain't no river wide, there ain't no mountain high, there ain't no valley that could ever come in between. There ain't no river wide, there ain't no mountain high, there ain't no valley that could ever come in between. There ain't no river wide, there ain't no mountain high, there ain't no valley that could ever come in between. There ain't no river wide, there ain't no mountain high, there ain't no valley that could ever come in. It's grace, grace, God's grace. It's grace that's greater than all our sin. It's grace, grace, God's grace. It's grace that's greater than all our sin. It's grace that's greater than all our sin. Grace, grace, God's grace. Grace that will pardon and cleanse within. Grace, grace, God's grace. Grace that is greater than all our sin. All right, keep standing. Nobody's flocked out yet. I know you had a hard day. Maybe this will help. In Christ alone, my hope is found. He is my light, my strength, my song. This cornerstone, this solid ground, firm through the fierce drought and storm. What heights of love, what depths of peace, when fears are stilled, when striving cease. My comforter, my all in all, here in the love of Christ I stand. In Christ alone, who took on flesh, fullness of God in helpless babe, this gift of love and righteousness, scorned by the ones he came to save, till on that cross that Jesus died, the wrath of God was satisfied, for every sin on him was laid. Here in the death of Christ I live. Then in the ground his body lay, light of the world by darkness slain. Then bursting forth in glorious day, up from the grave he rose again. And as he stands in victory, sin's curse has lost its grip on me, for I am his and he is mine, bought with the precious blood of Christ. No guilt in life, no fear in death. This is the power of Christ in me. From life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from his hand, till he returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from his hand, till he returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand, till he returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand. Be seated.
Can you hear me? All right, I have a confession to make. I just lip-synced the whole thing because I was scared this microphone would turn on and y'all would hear me sing. All right, well, appreciate y'all letting me come here and speak tonight. My goal tonight is to tell you about the most recent vision trip that I took. And for those of you who don't know what a vision trip is, it's just a fancy term to say, it's self-explanatory. It's a vision trip. I was going down to South America to try and figure out where the Lord wants me. And I was able to visit 3 different countries. I was able to visit Bolivia, Ecuador, and Paraguay. And so my purpose tonight is to tell you what I did on that trip, what I experienced, and what I learned. And as well, I hope to tell you where the Lord is leading me now and explain what He's doing in my life. I know that many of y'all have been praying for me for a long time to get clear direction. And I think I finally have some. I wouldn't say clear because, I don't know, the Christian life's kind of gray. It's the moral stuff's black and white, but when you're trying to figure out God's purpose for your life, it never seems very clear. And so if you could flip to the next slide. I'll start with Bolivia because that's the first place I went to. On this trip, I was gone for a total of 4 weeks, and I was able to visit 4 different teams. 4 different teams, 3 different countries. And the first connection that I had was a man named Hector, and he's pictured on the top left. It's he and I there in Bolivia. And I met Hector through a mutual friend of mine. So the people that I served with in Indonesia, they're actually from the UK. And so while I was in the UK, I ran into Hector. Now you might be wondering, what's a Bolivian guy doing in the UK? Well, he married a British girl. That British girl was a missionary to Bolivia. They got married, and they lived in Bolivia for a very long time. But here recently, and for some reasons I'm not quite sure, I think some medical issues, they had to move back to the UK because they have 2 kids that are getting older, and for whatever reason, it seemed best for them to be in the UK. So I was in the UK visiting, ran into this guy, and after speaking to him for a short time, I realized that we had a lot of similar interests. His family actually owns a cattle ranch in Bolivia, and for those of you who know me, I've been very interested in using agriculture or work as a platform for ministry. So this guy seemed like a perfect guy to talk to. We hit it off real well, exchanged numbers, and he invited me down to the ranch. And so pictured there on the right is some of the cowboys that work for him. So his family has owned this ranch for a long time, but he's actually a pastor by trade. So if you asked him what he did, he'd tell you he's a pastor, but his family also owns this ranch. So it was a really good opportunity for me to see the way churches are run in Bolivia, to see what ministry looks like there, but then to also get a chance to experience what a legitimate Bolivian ranch is like. And I'll tell you, it's not for the faint of heart. So you see, we're pictured there on some mules and horses. So it took 4 plane rides to get to his town, and then it was a 17-mile mule ride to get to the ranch. And then 80% of that journey was underwater. So this section of Bolivia, it's inundated with water half the year, and it's dry the other half of the year. So it's an extreme place, and the people there are pretty tough. And I think I stayed wet for 3 days. Whether it was rain or sweat, I don't think I had a dry patch of clothing on me for the whole time. But it was a really good experience, and it taught me a lot. I would say I learned a lot from Hector. Hector is very relational in the way he does evangelism, and that's why he and I hit it off so well, is because I would call myself a relational evangelist as well. Like I won't walk around telling people I'm an evangelist, but if I do evangelism, it would be relational. And so Hector's a little bit different than most pastors in Bolivia. Most churches in Bolivia kind of keep to themselves. They don't really venture outside of the 4 walls. The churches are not growing very quickly down there, and a lot of that is because, this is just my opinion of the short time I was there, but they're a little too self-centered. They don't look much outside the 4 walls of the church, and I think that it's never been modeled to them, the relational side of evangelism. So Hector's not afraid to socialize with anybody. He has non-Christian friends, Christian friends, he has rich friends, poor friends, and whenever he's in Bolivia visiting, he makes sure to see everybody. And so on the ranch, you can flip to the next slide, I was able to share my testimony with these guys through the help of Hector. He was a translator for me. And then Hector, because of his position in the community and his position as a pastor, they allowed him to give a little sermon. And one of the guys was actually interested in what he had to say, and Hector followed up with him afterwards. And you can go to the next slide. That would be that picture there on the left is all of the cowboys on the ranch, and then that was whenever we had our little sermon. And so that next picture, that's not just a random car. So I had to get from the ranch to a different city in Bolivia to visit a different team. And that car is actually a taxi. And so it's a front wheel drive with mud tires, and they load up a lot of weight on the top. And I had the trip was only 200 miles. It took me 18 hours. So I spent 18 hours in that stupid little car listening to the same 5 songs on repeat. And it was rough. It was a long night. But looking back, I really enjoyed it. So that's really the best mode of transportation there, because airplanes are kind of spotty. And it was towards the end of the rainy season, so the roads were dry enough to get there. But still, we broke down. I quit counting after 8 times. But finally, I made it to the city I needed to get to, took a plane, and I went to a different ecosystem, a different region of Bolivia. You can go to the next slide. I went up to a city in the mountains called Sucre. Now, within Sucre, that is where Pioneers has their base for Bolivia. So if I felt the Lord calling me to go to Bolivia, I would go to the city of Sucre and I would learn language and culture there. So I met the team that's there. It's a very small team. It's just a husband and wife and their young son who's about 13 or 14. And it was also a good opportunity to shadow this guy. Actually, let me back up. I got a little ahead of myself. On the ranch, the takeaways were, I learned about myself that I'm really attracted to the far out places. So if the Lord was to tell me, Colson, I want you to be an international missionary for me, and I was going to be ripped away from family and friends, the food I like to eat, college football, that good stuff, I'm going to, in my mind, make it worth it. I'm going to go way out there where nobody goes. But going way out there comes at a cost, and usually it comes at the cost of community and team, and it's tough to raise a family, as you could see in those pictures. It's just not conducive to having a wife and kids out there. And so there's two competing desires I have, and part of this vision trip was to try and help me, figure out, where the Lord's leading me, even though I have these two competing desires. And so while I was in Sucre, which would be pictures of this area, this is Sucre, the guy who runs the team, he's from Canada, and he actually married a Bolivian woman, and he's been in Bolivia for over 30-something years. So he has extensive relationships with all churches in the area. He's been very gifted at being able to plant churches. So the way Pioneers works, their goal is to go to an area where there's very few Christians, and their goal is to make disciples and then plant churches. And so the way that you find disciples in an area where there's very little Christian presence is you look for what's called people of peace. And that's just another way of saying finding someone who's willing to talk to you about spiritual matters. Because y'all have all probably experienced it in your own life. You maybe go to share the gospel with somebody, or you try and tread into the spiritual waters with somebody, and some people shut it down really, really quick, and they don't want to talk about it, and other people are willing to talk your head off about it. So if you're thinking about the best use of your time, you're going to go to the people who are willing to talk and are a little bit open to religious and spiritual matters. And so Greg, who's the team leader there, he's been really gifted at finding people of peace and then establishing churches and helping maintain healthy churches there. So much of his time, he's like a full-time minister. I guess you can imagine the type of work that you do. He's back and forth amongst different churches. He's not a pastor himself, but he's considered full-time ministry, whereas my friend Hector, he's not necessarily full-time. So it was good to see the contrast between the two. I learned a lot from him. I did learn that I'm not cut out to live in a foreign city. I could handle somewhere like Athens. That's about as big a city as I could probably handle. But I know that if I'm going to live in another culture, I definitely don't want to be in a city. Because I don't know how many of y'all have spent time in foreign cities, but they're not as romantic as you think they are. You can go to the next slide. I also got to visit Katie Lynn and them, which was just like a breath of fresh air to see them. If you're wondering how they're doing great. Mia's cute as ever. She's squirming and talking all over the place. And Nim is beginning the research phase of his doctoral studies, if any of y'all are familiar with what Nim is doing. And so a lot of his time is spent reconnecting with old friends that he had while he and Katie Lynn lived in the Amazon. And so he said that most all of his relationships with the village people, he was able to pick back up where he left off. And he was also able to show me two of his friends that he's now made in Ecuador have chocolate orchards, chocolate plantations. And I was able to tour them because part of this trip, I was looking for potential opportunities where I could serve. And obviously I want to use my gifts, and having an experience in Indonesia where I learned how to grow chocolate. Nim thought it would be a good idea for me to visit these places. I think you can go to the next slide. It's just a picture of Mia there on one of the chocolate plantations. But Katie Lynn and Nim were very influential in helping me, I guess you would say, take in the information that I had and help me sift through all the desires that I'm having about where the Lord is leading me. Because if you're looking to make a big life change and you're truly seeking where God wants you to go, it's not an easy overnight decision, because a lot of times we'll have competing desires. We'll have information from this person that's different from that person, and sometimes you just don't even know what you think. So Katie Lynn and them were very influential. They've been down that road before me, and like I said, it's always just nice to be around them. After talking with Nim for a while, I asked him how he enjoyed Ecuador versus the UK. And he said he really enjoyed being back in the Amazon. And I think Katie Lynn has had a little harder time adjusting back because she was telling me she was really surprised at how hard it was to leave the UK because of the ministry that she was a part of there was going so well. And so it was kind of, she said that she's happy that they moved to Ecuador. I don't want anybody to think that she's not happy. But she was just being honest with me. She said that as you follow God's plan for your life, there's going to be times where you make a decision. It doesn't necessarily feel right, but you just have to trust that the last thing God told you was go, and so you go. So it was just encouraging to hear that from her. You can go to the next slide. The last stop of my trip was Paraguay. I met another Pioneers missions team, and I keep saying this word Pioneers. For anybody who doesn't know, the missions organization that I work with, they're called Pioneers. So that's all I mean when I'm saying Pioneers. But I went to a small city that's about 10 hours south of the capital of Paraguay, and I met with a team. This team is just one family unit, husband and wife and 4 kids. They're actually Australian, and they're doing medical missions in Paraguay. So both the husband and the wife, if you flip 2 slides forward, there'll be a picture of the family. There they are. I tried to grow a mustache, and you can see why I shaved it before I came back. Those two there on the left, they're both doctors by training. And so they are using their past education as doctors. They've set up a medical clinic where they give free medical services to people. But before they give the medical services, they always give a devotion. But in Paraguay, you can flip back 1 slide. In Paraguay, throughout most of South America, and forgive me if I'm all over the place, but throughout most of South America, everyone speaks Spanish. But in Paraguay, it's a little bit different. They speak a language called Guarani. And so it's a native language. It's been around for a long, long time. And if you're wondering what it's like imagine what maybe Cherokee Indians sound like. That's kind of like what Guarani is. It has no roots in English, very different than Spanish. And so if you're going to be a missionary there, it actually takes you about 1.5 years to learn that language. So if you're going to work in Paraguay, you have to learn Spanish and then about 1.5 years of Guarani. So it's 2 years before you're really even making relationships with people. So this couple has made a really big commitment to Paraguay, but they're sure this is where the Lord wants them. So I was able to shadow them, I guess you could say, and Sam, who is the husband of that family, he's the doctor, he knows that I was interested in agriculture as well, and he really invested a lot of time and allowed me to meet with 2 ranchers in the area that he kind of knew, and I was able to sit down and ask them any question I wanted. So I asked them about what would it take to start some sort of agricultural business here in Paraguay, what kind of red tape do you have to walk through, and that family was just very good about investing time to allow me to do the research that I needed to see if Paraguay was a place that would be suitable for me to go. Like Katie Lynn and them were, this family was very influential in helping me figure out where the Lord wanted me. They didn't try and persuade me to come to Paraguay. They were very adamant. They said, look, we're not trying to persuade you to go anywhere. We just want to help you find out what the Lord has in store for you. So Paraguay was nice. I learned in Paraguay that it's something I'd never thought about before, So for those of you who are familiar with the different missional strategies you can have, I'm not going to go into detail, but you can go like a traditional route where you're just a full-time minister and your only job is to build relationships with people and share the gospel. So your church family back home funds you, and your only job is to just do ministry in the classical sense. There's also a ministry model called BAM, which is just acronym for Business as Missions. So a lot of missionaries nowadays in countries that are closed, where you have to have, like in Muslim countries, you have to have a legitimate reason to be there to get a visa. So a lot of missionaries will develop a business, a legitimate business, and they'll just be businessmen who happen to live in a closed country. So those are the 2 different types of business models. And Paraguay made me realize that if you're going to a country that's open, like Paraguay, you don't have to sneak in. You can just be upfront, and you can tell the government, hey, I'm a missionary, I want to live here, and they give you a visa. It's that simple. So there's no persecution there from the government. And so if you're thinking about the best use of time and resources, I realized that if I was going to start a business in Paraguay, it was going to eat up a vast majority of my time. So I'd have to do 2 years of language study, and then it would probably take 2 years or so of working my tail off to start a business. I realized I would have very little time to build the relationships. And that's the whole point of being a missionary, is that you build relationships with non-believers to be able to share the gospel. And so I realized on this trip that using the business model, it really makes the most sense in a closed country. Because if you're going to have your church family back home supporting you, it would seem as though spending 4 years to get a business going and not developing any close relationships with Paraguayans doesn't seem like the best use of resources. And I'd never really thought about that before. And I'm not saying that if you're serving in an open country, you have to do missions a certain way. Whatever God tells you to do, do it. But I'd never thought about that before. And this vision trip was very influential in opening my eyes to the many different types of ministry models you can have when you're an international missionary. And I think, flip 2 slides. I'm not sure if there's any pictures there. Okay. All right, so I went on this vision trip. It was a whole month away from home. Took in all of this information. And the whole point was to figure out, where does God want me next? And I realized on this trip that I have no stronger desire for people in Bolivia or Paraguay to come to faith than I do for people here in America. You know, for the longest time, I've been thinking that the Lord has been calling me to do international ministry, and I had tunnel vision, and I really wasn't listening to any of the other influences God was giving me. I guess, you know, sometimes in the Christian life, we get a word from God. Excuse me. Still, that's kind of embarrassing. Sometimes we get a word from God, and then, that got me all off track. All right. Word from God, that's right. It's dry up here, let me tell you. You get a word from God, and then once we get that word, I don't need any water. Is that what you're doing? I'm fine. We get a word from God, and then we just kind of take off, and we never stop to think, hey, God, do you want me to turn left or right? You want me to slow down? You want me to speed up? And that's kind of what I had done. I'd gotten a word from God about 2 years ago. He said, go. And so that was the only thing on my mind, and I was not listening to God daily. And I think all of us Christians at some point in life have been guilty of that. You know, it's like we're thinking 5 years down the road, but God asks us to follow Him daily. In the Lord's Prayer, He says, give us this day our daily bread. He doesn't say, give us today our monthly bread, our yearly bread. Give us our lifetime of bread today. It's your daily bread. And so I realized that I had gotten kind of fixated on this idea that the Lord was trying to steer me in a different direction, but I wasn't having it. I was so fixated on international missions. And I'm not here to be for or against any of that. I'm just telling you, as a Christian, you have to remind yourself daily to ask God for direction. And so now the Lord's made it pretty clear to me that He wants me to stay in Athens, or at least this general area. And the reason I feel like the Lord is calling me here is because in Athens, there's tons and tons of college students who are hungry for the gospel. There's a lot of young Christians in Athens who are looking to grow. And so being in Athens, there's a big, I guess you could call it a discipleship-making movement. And what I mean by making disciples is really just being a wise mentor to younger Christians, which is what all of us are supposed to be doing. So I'm not a wise old sage, but I know more than a 19-year-old. So I take some of these young college kids and teach them, try and help them not make some of the same mistakes I did, and just invest time into their lives. And these kids are really hungry for the gospel. As well, I'm involved in an international student ministry. So being in Athens, there's obviously lots of college students. There's also lots of international college students. So they come here to America, they leave their friends and family behind, and they have very few friends, and some of them don't understand American culture. So I'm looking to use hospitality as a means to share the gospel with these people. So even last week, a week ago, I discussed with 2 of my Hindu friends. We talked about Hinduism for an hour or 2. They were just at my house having dinner. And then yesterday, I had a 20-year-old college student over at my house. He's somebody I've been pouring into for a while. And so I realized that on this trip, I have all of these opportunities to do ministry in Athens. Why run off into the wild blue yonder when God has brought the nations to my door and has given me many opportunities here. And I don't know if anyone remembers, last summer I spoke on the parable of the talents and stewardship. Someone asked me the other day, they said, Colson, what's your core driving value? And I had to think about it for a while, and I realized that it's stewardship. God has given us so much. Like, I've been blessed with good family. I've been blessed financially. I've been blessed in 1,000 different ways. And so I want to be able to use all that God has given me to its fullest potential. And in light of this vision trip, I was thinking, well, where are my gifts and talents going to be most utilized at this stage in life? I'm approaching an age where I feel like I'm in a category of people that just kind of shrinks. You get into your late 20s and you're still single. You look around, you're like, well, nobody else seems like they're single. What am I doing wrong? But I realized with that singleness comes freedom to invest in other people. I have so much more time than most people have. So I work a full-time job, but after work, I'm spending all of that time with other people, and hopefully with people who aren't believers. And so if I could encourage y'all in any way, I'd like to leave y'all with this thought. One is stewardship. God has given every single one of you specific gifts and talents. And when you get to heaven, you don't want to show up and say, God, I know you gave me all this, but I didn't really use it well. So obviously none of us want to be in that boat. So I just want to encourage you, find out what you're good at and use it for His glory. But also I would challenge you to look at evangelism through a different lens. I know that we like to put evangelism in a box, and evangelism sometimes just becomes walking up to a stranger and sharing the gospel with them. Obviously, sometimes the Spirit encourages us to do that. I'm not putting that down at all. But I've realized over the years with my skill set that I'm really good at building relationships with people. And so I've realized that as a single person, I have all this free time. I'm really good at building relationships with people. Well, let me take all this time, build relationships, and through those bridges and those friendships, I get plenty of opportunities to share the gospel with people who otherwise wouldn't hear it. Like, I think a lot about my international friends. Sometimes I have to spend like 20 hours with somebody before I even get the chance to share the gospel with them. Sometimes it takes 40. Sometimes it just takes one visit. And so I would just encourage you, if you're thinking about things that you could sacrifice for the Lord, maybe think about sacrificing some of your time. I know that all of y'all have friends who probably aren't believers, and if you don't have to look far to find them. And so if I could just leave you with that encouragement, I'm not trying to get on anybody. I'm just saying, maybe look at evangelism through a different lens. And so I think we have a little bit of time left for questions. Sorry if I was a little scatterbrained and talked fast, but had a lot of thoughts that I was trying to get out. So if you have any questions, please fire away. If we have time, if nobody asks a question, I'll tell you about my cab driver in Paraguay. It's a pretty good story. All right, I'll tell you about my cab driver in Paraguay. So I took a long bus ride from one city in Paraguay to another, and I had to get to the center of the city and make it to the airport on time. Oh, speaking of which, on this trip, I totally missed a flight. It left at 3 a.m., showed up at 3 p.m., and so I don't know if any of y'all prayed for me, got it all worked out. That was pretty embarrassing. But I don't know if you've ever gone to check in for a flight. I went to check in, it said, your flight has arrived. I said, well, that's not my flight, obviously, and then I realized it left at 3 a.m. Anyhow, I was in Paraguay. I had to get a cab ride, so I tapped on the window of this cab. The cab driver was sleeping. He was like a thinner old man, probably early 60s, about 140 pounds soaking wet, like thin, wiry hair. I don't know why that matters. But I got in the car, and I told him, I said, hey, man, can you take me to the center of the city? And all this was in Spanish. I don't speak Spanish, but I can get around in a Spanish-speaking country. He says, oh, yeah, amigo, let's go. So we hop in the car and go. About halfway to our destination, we get stuck in a traffic jam. And so he's laying on the horn. I mean, he's just giving it to the guy in front of us. And the guy in front of us can't go anywhere because obviously we're stuck in traffic. So the guy in front of us gets so annoyed, he pulls his car over to the left on about 6 inches. So my cab driver whips it around to the right and just destroys his taillight, and we keep on rolling. He doesn't slow down for anything. But we're in a traffic jam, and so we only go about 20 yards, and then we stop. And so the guy that we hit, he comes up to the window. They're just going back and forth at it, just back and forth, back and forth. I don't even know what they're saying. And I start to thinking to myself, I might not should be in this car for too long if this continues. And so there's a break in traffic. We pull forward. My cab driver's so preoccupied with the guy he hit behind us, he hits the guy in front of us, just slams into the back of him. And so I think, oh goodness, here we go. The other guy gets out of the car. Now we got two guys coming in the window at us. They're all mad. Everybody's mad. Well, my cab driver, calm, cool, and collected, reaches under his seat and pulls out about a 9-inch fish fillet knife. And he jumps out of the car and starts waving that thing around in the air, just going absolutely crazy. And at this point, I thought, I've got two options. I can stick around, or I can just be the white guy running down the street after somebody gets stabbed. That didn't seem like the best option. And so I decided to sit in the car. I made myself as small as possible, just kind of laid down in the seat. The cab driver gets back in the car, slams the door shut, and we take off. And he didn't say a word the whole time. He never said, sorry, buddy. He never said, be calm. Just nothing. He just didn't say a word. We make it to our destination. I pay him. He gives me correct change, tells me have a great day. And that was the end of that. So if you're ever in Paraguay and get a cab driver, he's a thin, wiry guy with white hair. Just watch out. But he was actually the most honest cab driver I had my whole time. All the other cab drivers will lie to you, try to make you pay more than you need to pay. But I don't know if that was edifying to y'all, but I really like telling that story. Older, sorry. Older. That's right. It's all just a mindset anyway, right? Age. Yeah.
Is there a group you work with on campus? Is there a YWAM or Pioneers or something?
There are lots of ministries on campus. My roommate is with Campus Crusade, for any of y'all who are familiar with them. And so I know a lot of Campus Crusade people. A lot of my friends are with them, but I'm not directly involved with them. The only ministry I'm directly involved with is a student-led ministry, and it would be the International Student Ministry. It's not a nationwide thing. Right now, I think it's only at UGA. It was a vision a couple students had a few years ago, and it's supposed to be student-led. So obviously I'm not a student, but there's a few people who aren't students who kind of just make sure things run smoothly. So that would be the only ministry I'm completely associated with.
You don't have a map of South America, do you? I'm 50-some years out of geography, and I don't know where all those countries are actually located. I mean, are they northern?
Now, I apologize, I didn't put a map on. Let's see, if you know where, if you were looking at a map of South America, would you recognize Brazil? Biggest one? Okay. Let's go due west, and that would be Bolivia and Ecuador. They're on that same latitude. Paraguay. If you know where Argentina is and Chile, they go all the way down to the bottom. Paraguay is above those countries. So it's lower latitude than Brazil, but above Argentina.
You say that ranch is pretty close to Brazil border?
Yeah, the ranch I was on the border of Brazil. It actually touched so like here, if I said Indian reservation, you would understand what I mean. It would be the equivalent of an Indian reservation there. But this is slightly different. There's really not that many people that live in those reserves. And they're not all necessarily still in loincloths or anything. But I did feel kind of like cowboys and Indians riding around there knowing there's a reservation not too far away. Panther? Oh, okay. I got to go hunting with some of the cowboys on the ranch, and while we were walking through the jungle, stalking after some pigs, we noticed some jaguar paw prints, and we noticed them going in, and then on the way out, we noticed the tracks had stepped through our footprints. So there was a jaguar that was really, really close. Actually, that same jaguar, they think, killed a couple calves on that ranch. So you can see why I like the place. You know, riding horses around everywhere, lassoing stuff. There's jaguars in the woods, but didn't necessarily enjoy being wet and all the ticks though. It was pretty rough. Worst mosquitoes I've ever experienced in my life, bar none.
What's the most exotic food you had down there?
This trip didn't get too exotic. I had the opportunity to eat one of those giant fat grubs. They're like that long. I was with Nim actually, and he saw me eyeballing them. He said, "You want one?" And I said, "I don't think so, not this trip." So that was the closest thing. The food was actually, so like you would imagine South American food to be super spicy, but I feel like each country you get away from Central America, the spice level tones down. So Paraguay, it was almost like no spice, but Ecuador, Bolivia had a little bit more spice. It's just heavy meat and starches. So it means it's good, but it's not necessarily exotic. Of all the countries I went to, Bolivia is definitely the most exotic. Bolivia is still kind of revered as like a last frontier country. Bolivia is really poor. For some reason, there's a lot of corruption there, more so than the other countries. There's a lot of crazy wildlife. It's just still kind of considered a last frontier of South America. There was if you know what a capybara is, I think in Spanish is capybara. They have those all over the place, but I didn't get a chance to eat one. Some people eat those. I drank a corn drink they call chicha. It's kind of exotic, but not really that crazy. So if you're ever there, I'd recommend it. It's called chicha. Argentina. I didn't make it there, but I met one in the airport. And I spoke to her in Spanish for 3 hours, and I was exhausted at the end of it all. But it was well worth it. I didn't. I knew I wouldn't be coming back, so. Regret it now, though. Hey, look, do what you gotta do. They're pretty dang close. They're pretty close, yeah. In Athens, I'm going to a church now called Living Hope. And they're technically non-denominational, but they were a church plant of a Baptist church out of Watkinsville. So if any of y'all are familiar with First Baptist Watkinsville, they've planted quite a few churches around because they're growing so much. And so this church is a plant of that one. And I'm enjoying it so far. I'm really involved in a small group that they have. I haven't really met everybody in the congregation yet because it's slightly larger. But I would say they're a little bit, because they're non-denominational, they're like a Baptist church. I would describe them as maybe the most charismatic Baptist church you've ever been to, where their doctrine is all Baptist doctrine, but in the worship service you'd see a lot more hand raising and stuff like that. But other than that, doctrine's almost the same.
Do the international students engage with any of the churches in the area, or?
They'll go if you invite them, because they're looking to experience American culture while they're here, and they know that most people in America, especially the Southeast, would claim to be Christian. So they would, if they went, they might go just because they're your friend. They might go because they're interested to see what Christian church is like. But I would say that it depends on the religion too. So if they're Hindu, they're willing to pretty much pray to any god. But if they're Muslim, you'd have a lot harder time convincing a Muslim to go to church with you. So I have one close friend, he's a Muslim, and I could tell you he'd be less likely to go to church with me than my Hindu friends. And so if you're close friends with somebody, they're not looking to be rude to you. And so I would say a lot of it depends on the relationship. But you don't see international students going to church without someone. inviting them or taking them. Currently, so I feel happy to know that I have some direction, but in other areas of my life, the Lord's been closing a lot of doors that I thought were going to be open. So if you could just pray for me to trust God that His plan is best, even though it doesn't always look as such. Because, like on paper, we all obviously trust God. If you're going to ask me, do you trust God? Like, well, of course, I trust Him. But whenever you get different doors shut, you start asking yourself and you start doubting yourself. You might even start doubting God. And so if you could just pray for that I would just completely trust God, especially in the little details. I think me and my parents were discussing this the other day. And the question I posed to them was, how small of details does God care about in your life? Like, it kind of depends on your theology, I guess, what your final answer would be. But I just remember posing that question to them because it was on my mind. It's like, how does God care about some of these little things that are going on in my life? And I had this thought the other day that, we would say, oh, this is a big detail in my life, or this is a small detail. But to God, honestly, I think they're all the same. Because how am I going to say that this detail I think is big? God's infinite. So like your big deal versus your small deal is probably all the same to Him. So if you could just pray that I just trust God in His timing.
Why Bolivia and Paraguay? Is it because of the contacts, or was it because they were open?
Because of the contacts. So those were the only teams in South America that Pioneers had. I really wanted to visit Brazil, but they just don't have any teams there right now. And so I haven't shut the door on missions. If God calls me and makes it clear, I'll go. And in the back of my mind, I'm still thinking about Brazil and potentially Africa to visit one day.
Do you think that through your contacts with international students in Athens, that would be an asset or I don't want to use the word stepping stone, but that would be, you could use that as an asset to get you to Africa or to get you to
For sure.
other foreign countries that you haven't been to?
Definitely. So most of these, I would say I have 4 international friends that I would say I'm close with, and they've all made it very clear to me, if you ever travel near my country, you have to stop by my house. Most of them are very hospitable people. And so yes, I could definitely use them to help me get somewhere. And maybe using them's not the right word, but you know what I mean, yeah. Because I'd like to see them, because they're my friends, yeah. And the hope, one of the, not a strategy, but almost like a benefit, these international students that come to Athens, they're from well-off and wealthy families. Because, if you're barely making ends meet, you don't have enough money to go to college in America. So most of these people come from some sort of affluence, and the hope is that they come to America, experience Christ, and then take Him back to their town where they have influence over many, many people. So that's obviously not the only reason we would go share the gospel with international students, but it's like an added bonus if they come to know Christ.
Where are some of the countries that these students are from that you are, making connections?
Yeah, Bangladesh, India, Ecuador, a lot of Nigerians, lots of people from China. You actually get a smattering of Eastern European countries. People come here from there. Really all over the world. Not so much South America, but more so Africa, South Asia, Europe.
How difficult is it to get international students to come to your location? Or, how well known in Athens is Colson Dodson?
Well, I'm with
We got a billboard going in town.
Yeah, that's right. Call me if you need a friend, is what it says. Uh, the ministry I work with, the International Student Ministry, it's a student-led organization, and so there's probably 20 people like myself. And we put on, during the school semester, we put on bi-weekly events where we invite all international students to a free dinner. There we meet people, and then it's outside of those events that we'll become better friends. We actually took, me and my friend, we took 2 Indian students and showed them how to shoot a shotgun. Like, I wouldn't recommend everybody teaching an Indian person how to shoot a shotgun, but it was a blast, and they really enjoyed it. And so every time they call their family, they tell them, like, we shot an American gun. So, yeah, they really enjoyed that. So it's just simple stuff like that. You know, most of the time that I spend with people, it's not a formal sanctioned event. People just know where I live. Or, like, let's say I get off of work, and it's 5:30, 6 or something, I just might call a friend who I know lives down the street and say, hey, would you want to come over for dinner tonight or play tennis or something like that. Just real simple stuff. Just living life, but not doing it alone.
What line of work are you doing in that?
I'm in construction right now. Yep, doing some framing and trim work. But it's a small company. It's me and one other guy. And I really enjoy it too. I really like my job. I like the guy I work with, and I like the work that we do. All right, it's 8. Do we need to stop? I think I've said all I'm going to say. If y'all don't have any more questions.